All right, this is Kelsey from the Coastal Commission. Again, I think I'm going to pass it off to Mary, who's going to get us started today.
Thanks, Kelsey. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for an orientation to the draft policy guidance for residential adaptation to sea level rise. Again, my name is Mary Matella, and I'm an environmental scientist at the Coastal Commission. And I'm joined here by other members of the Commission Sea Level Rise team in San Francisco. So I'd like to begin today with an overview of the presentation. And I just want to note that the content of this presentation is the same as given in our August 2nd webinar. And the draft document and slides are posted on our website for your reference. Today I'll talk a little bit about the background of the project and the process of preparing the draft guidance. I'll then present a summary of the new draft guidance contents and how you can offer comments. And I'll conclude with our plans for next steps, and then our team will take any questions you might have. Now, due to the number of people on the call, we're not going to be opening the lines for verbal questions. So please enter your comments or your questions at any time during the presentation in the questions box of the web interface so that we can try to be ready to answer as many questions as possible after we're done with the presentation. And note that this webinar will also be recorded and posted later. So right now, I'd like to do a quick poll just to give folks a sense of who's on the line. So we'd like to have you let us know what type of organization you represent. So Kelsey, can you run that for folks? Give a few minutes for people to enter in what type of organization they may represent. How are we looking?
All right, it's looking pretty stable. Feel free to keep voting for a little while. It looks like we have mostly, a majority of folks are in the local government, about 62%, about a quarter just from the other category, and then a few folks from state agencies. Go ahead and answer. I'll keep it open for a couple more seconds.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, thanks everyone.
Did you push it onto the display?
There you can see who all is joining us now.
Okay. Just give us a sense of what types of organizations are represented. So back to the slides, I'd like to just give a little bit of project background. This document is a product of the Coastal Commission's fiscal year 2014 NOAA Federal Grant Project of Special Merit. The overall goal of this project is to ensure that shoreline development and redevelopment is resilient to coastal hazards while maximizing protection of coastal resources, such as public access to the beach and shoreline, recreation, visual resources, and shoreline ecology along the coast. The final product will be an adopted policy guidance that is intended to assist local governments in planning for sea level rise adaptation for residential development. This project also builds on and complements the Commission's sea level rise policy guidance adopted by the Commission in August of 2015 and supports the achievement of numerous strategic plan action items, objectives, and goals. So I'd like to begin framing the sea level rise adaptation challenge that this draft guidance aims to address for residential development. This draft policy guidance focuses on residential development because it is one of the most prevalent community development patterns along California's coast, and it poses one of the more frequent hazard management challenges today. However, as sea levels rise and beaches migrate inland, maintaining development adjacent to the shoreline will result in narrowing and eventual loss of beaches, dunes, and other shoreline and offshore recreational areas. This new challenge to public access has the potential to cause significant conflicts with the Coastal Act, which was enacted for the purpose of protecting California's coastal resources. It also conflicts with the public trust doctrine, as embodied in other statutes, Article 10, Section 4 of the California Constitution, and the common law. Furthermore, it presents a significant environmental justice issue if residents continue to enjoy shoreline access while the general public is blocked from accessing the shore. So as I mentioned before, the overall goal of this project is to provide assistance to local governments to update local coastal programs, or LCPs, to address sea level rise, to ensure that shoreline development and redevelopment is resilient to coastal hazards while maximizing protection of coastal resources. The final product will be adopted policy guidance that provides an in-depth discussion of sea level rise adaptation policies specifically related to residential development, accompanied by examples of policies that cities and counties could modify for use in different community and geologic contexts. In the process of developing this draft policy guidance for residential development, Commission staff assessed existing shoreline residential areas and reviewed existing LCP planning documents, mapping, and various data sets to identify and characterize coastal areas of the state. Staff proposed a typology, or classification of shoreline types, to describe the residential development and hazard conditions found along California's coastline. This typology is useful for guiding the application of alternative statewide sea level rise adaptation policies that are consistent with the Coastal Act. The project development was guided by a steering committee of internal staff members, including staff with legal, enforcement, engineering, ecology, and district expertise, and the sea level rise team with subject matter expertise. This group was instrumental in shaping the Coastal Act policy analysis and model policy language. So communication with interested stakeholders through conferences and several years of working with LCP grantees has informed the drafting phase of developing this draft policy guidance. Commission staff will continue to work with local governments and other interested stakeholders to glean valuable input in shaping the policy guidance and model language. We expect the comment period to contribute a substantial amount to our next version. I will talk more about input opportunities later in the presentation as well. So here's a quick highlight of important concepts about using this draft document. This guidance is advisory and not a regulatory document or legal standard of review. Not all of the content will be applicable to all jurisdictions, and the content gives a menu of options to use only if relevant rather than a checklist of required actions. Model policies need customization for application to individual areas, and they can aid consultation of local government with Commission staff when local governments are determining applicable policies. There are 7 sections to the policy guidance. The first 6 sections serve as a type of application guide for how to use the model policy language to update an LCP. It describes background on LCP planning, residential development, and the challenges that sea level rise presents for different types of hazards and development, and principles that apply to all hazardous areas, as well as strategies for specific types of areas. Sections on legal considerations, implementation, and case studies then follow. The final section comprises about half the document, and it presents 7 types of strategies, which I'll discuss more in the coming slides. Staff proposed a typology, or systematic classification of types, that have similar characteristics to describe the residential development and hazard conditions found along California's coastline. We considered geomorphic setting and development density in categorizing 6 broad types of residential development: urban bluff-top, urban beachfront, urban estuary, and low-density bluff-top, low-density beachfront, and low-density estuary. We created the typology because each type has different hazard impacts and feasible adaptation strategies. Now, despite the residential typology, there are some policy types that are universally applicable in concept. While adaptation strategies should be chosen based on the specific risks and vulnerabilities of a particular region or project site, in the context of applicable Coastal Act and LCP requirements, the following broad policies exemplify important concepts for a strong LCP framework addressing sea level rise: best available science, risk disclosure, avoiding hazards through siting and design, and redevelopment regulation. So we have 5 best available science policies that demonstrate model options for integrating best available science on sea level rise into LCP planning through the use of sea level rise scenarios, mapping, and technical reports. All communities should also be considering longer planning horizons and phased approaches that inform property owners and the public about planned adaptation through mechanisms such as hazard overlay zones, deed restrictions, real estate disclosures, and assurances or waivers of rights based on defined triggers sensitive to the specific planning context. Development should be required to be resilient and safe, while assuring the protection of shoreline recreational resources and ecological values. Avoiding flooding and erosion through setbacks, siting and design decisions that locate development at safe distances from potential hazards should be the first consideration for all types of new development. Now, because many communities have existing development in hazardous areas already, it will be challenging to ensure that redevelopment is also resilient to future hazards, especially because redevelopment occurs incrementally. Redevelopment strategies, then, are the foundation for implementing many types of adaptation for existing development. These strategies are low cost compared to armoring solutions, and they allow property owners to continue use of their property until rebuilding restrictions can phase out high risk and high impact development over time. Different types of strategies will be appropriate in different locations and for different hazard management and resource protection goals. Here are some broad categories of related adaptation strategies that are represented in Section 7 of the draft policy guidance. I want to say that for the purposes of implementing the Coastal Act, no single category or even specific strategy should be considered the best option as a rule. In most cases, especially for LCP land use and implementation plans, multiple adaptation strategies will be needed, and every community will need to assess their risks and their potential options at multiple scales. In light of this need, community-scale adaptation planning policy samples offer ideas for local governments to consider. As a part of the planning process, of course, community visioning and participation in developing an adaptation plan are vital to scoping the appropriate strategies a community will consider phasing over time to address hazards as they become manifest. So here on this slide are some example policies that are in the policy guidance that might apply to three distinct geomorphic cases: bluff, beach, and estuary environments. These could apply in multiple shoreline settings, and they're meant to illustrate here connections of shoreline situations with sample policies. Again, in many cases, a hybrid approach that uses strategies from multiple categories will be necessary, and the suite of strategies may need to change over time to address increased sea level rise and associated increased exposure to hazards. The legal context of various options will also need to be considered in each situation, and ultimately, adaptive responses will need to be consistent with the Coastal Act. So this section on legal considerations contains Coastal Act policy analysis in the beginning and gives a recap of some of the public trust background that you can see in the 2015 Sea Level Rise Policy Guidance. Now, this version presents additional information about Coastal Commission and local government public trust authority and duties. Sea level rise adaptation policies may potentially give rise to takings concerns, and because the determination of whether a particular policy or regulation may in some circumstances be applied in a way that constitutes a taking is so fact-intensive and context-specific, this guidance cannot provide a simple set of parameters for when agencies should either allow exceptions to a land use regulation or consider purchasing a property interest. However, the guidance does provide policy recommendations that could reduce the potential for a successful takings claim. Navigating the balance between coastal resource protection and private property rights will require careful consideration of relevant precedent, nexus and rough proportionality, background principles of property law, and distinguishing government takings from takings by the forces of nature. Now on to implementation of the strategies that will be selected by local governments. The steps on this slide are from the 2015 Coastal Commission Sea Level Rise Policy Guidance, and these provide the broadest framework for addressing sea level rise in an LCP. All communities should step through this framework when planning to update their LCPs to address sea level rise. It starts with choosing a range of relevant sea level rise projections and identifying sea level rise impacts and risks to resources and development. These are essentially the vulnerability assessment elements, and they're the first three steps. Now, identifying adaptation measures and implementing and monitoring are adaptation steps, and these are the following three steps. In reality, the implementation of the same LCP steps happens at the project level through these LCP policies. This crosswalk here on this slide shows how Section 7 sample policies can fit into the process of comprehensively addressing sea level rise. After identifying appropriate adaptation strategies for each planning area, communities can look to the sample policy compendium in Section 7 for policy language that can help implement those strategies. You can look to the draft guidance for more detail on all of these. Now, a helpful approach for coastal communities to consider when planning for sea level rise involves phasing in short and long-term adaptation strategies. This concept of adaptation planning pathways provides a structure for sequencing adaptation measures using the time horizon of expected sea level rise impacts. Many Section 7 model policies facilitate implementation of this approach. For example, distinguishing between short and long-term actions and triggers are inherent in such policies as D1, removal conditions and development duration, G5, beach replenishment, G7, repetitive loss, and G8, beach management plan. The planning pathway approach for community-scale adaptation also provides a way to manage uncertainty in timing and extent of sea level rise impact by incorporating triggering actions in the planning or implementation stages of the strategy. For example, triggers related to the extent of flooding or the frequency of damages might be selected to initiate new phases of adaptation, as you can kind of see on this example that I have on this slide. Now, these triggers should be informed by local community involvement, and they will reflect a community's risk tolerance, local conditions, and their adaptation vision. The section here for case studies presents 6 short case studies of coastal communities that have some portion of their coastal shoreline that fits into the groups determined by the conceptual typology. And we're doing this to demonstrate how adaptation is currently being approached. Now let me mention a few of the relevant issues in each of the case studies. Newport Beach. This example illustrates issues related to bulkheads and public tidelands. The Broad Beach example highlights the testing of hybrid shoreline protection, a beach nourishment and revetment combination. Solana Beach highlights seawalls, redevelopment, and recreation mitigation policies. Bodega Bay is a low-density estuary with examples related to wetlands protection and development removal conditions. The Stinson Beach case study notes the integration of FEMA regulations and structural elevation to address sea level rise. And the Big Lagoon example discusses cabin relocations and triggers for structure removal as bluff edges erode. These case studies just demonstrate the variety of approaches being explored for these different shoreline types. Now on to the second half of the draft policy guidance. The model policies are intended to provide guidance for the development of LCP policies with an emphasis on applicability to residential development. Not all approaches listed here will be appropriate for every jurisdiction, and nor is this an exhaustive list of options. And in addition, looking at a single policy does not indicate how the entire LCP achieves compliance with the Coastal Act. Now, I also want to note here that local governments structure their LCPs through their land use plans and implementation plans in a variety of ways, with some local governments including significant policy detail in the land use plan, and some reserving such detail for the implementation plan. Some of the model policies in the guidance reflect a more general policy, as most commonly seen in a land use plan, and some have more relevance to implementation or zoning policy, more typically seen in an implementation plan. Local governments should customize the model policies to align with their community's approach and to facilitate timely development of adaptation strategies. So this category here, understanding sea level rise hazards, describes the model policies that best define best available science, anticipated duration of development types, coastal hazard zones, and technical studies required in given contexts to provide ways to inform risk assessments and plan for the future effects of sea level rise and coastal hazards. Assumption of risk policies and real estate disclosures provide important mechanisms for educating property owners about hazards and their options for addressing them in the future. The policies in Section B are meant to be used together to provide guidance for new development on vacant parcels, as well as more complex redevelopment in areas with existing residential patterns. The intent of these policies is to site and design to protect coastal resources and minimize risks to life and property to the maximum extent feasible, using mechanisms such as setbacks, redevelopment definitions, non-conforming structure, and land division restrictions in areas threatened by sea level rise. Understanding the more complex redevelopment and takings concerns for some communities, new policies for removal plans and reliance on shoreline protection will be important for proactive sea level rise planning. Accommodation strategies rely on methods that modify existing developments or design new developments to decrease hazards risks and thus increase the resiliency of development to the impacts of sea level rise. Design options for accommodation can be an important part of phasing a community's response to sea level rise impacts. The policy sample in our document is general, but it could be customized to the applicable hazards a community is confronting. It cross-references another policy for flood hazard mitigation design options as well. These strategies in Section D are related to removal conditions and retreat management plans. There's also a sample on contingency funds to finance removal if it becomes necessary to modify, remove, or relocate structures when removal triggers are met. The concepts of moving development away from hazards are also present in the Section G, Community Scale Adaptation Planning section. The model policies related to habitat buffers, soft shoreline protection, stormwater impacts, and flood hazard mitigation should be considered for relevant shoreline types. It is also important to note that the term soft shoreline armoring can refer to shoreline restoration projects or to shoreline armoring that includes a natural component, such as a revetment that is buried beneath sand and vegetated. While the former may be a permissible restoration project in many circumstances, the latter constitutes shoreline armoring that is generally not permitted to protect new development, though it's required to be approved if it is necessary to protect an existing structure or coastal-dependent use, and is the least environmentally damaging feasible alternative as required by the Coastal Act. Managing shoreline armoring has been challenging for many local governments because urban areas are frequently made up of both developed and undeveloped lots. In addition, many developments in existence in 1976 have since been redeveloped through renovations, remodeling, additions, and complete demolition and rebuilds. The reality of effective shoreline management is that the Coastal Act and LCPs must address and be applied to a wide variety of physical and legal circumstances that may not be addressed by a simple application of the Clean Coastal Act distinction between existing development that may be entitled to shoreline armoring and new development that is not. We present in this section 10 sample shoreline armoring policies that can offer guidance for many of the shoreline armoring contexts, laying out the general policies first, then offering details on prioritization, siting and design, mitigation, and expectations for the shoreline armoring in the future. Now, much of the sea level rise adaptation for residential land use will require a community approach, as the scope of parcel-level actions is too limited to address all coastal hazard impacts, especially when existing residential patterns are already located in hazardous locations. For example, unless individual bulkheads in a community are raised together, the lowest one will be the weak link and expose larger areas, homes, and roads to flooding. Community-scale adaptation plans should also take into account other climate change impacts, such as changes in precipitation patterns, fire frequency, etc., and they need to work with other counties and cities to develop and incorporate expectations for potential future impacts given other watershed scale changes. These changes may be related to climate change effects, other development upstream, or other management decisions and processes. Trigger-based adaptation approaches present a mechanism by which adaptation actions can be phased over time. These policies should be developed through a community adaptation planning process that specifies appropriate trigger types and responsive actions, such as beach nourishment, or programs such as managed retreat programs. The model policies G7 through G9 contain conceptual elements or triggers that could be written into a single customized policy for a particular location. For example, a managed retreat program could use repetitive loss or beach width triggers to set community priorities for targeted buyouts. Additionally, a similar policy to the managed retreat program for beaches could be applied for wetlands or other habitat areas subject to sea level rise. Now, how you write a policy also depends on the geomorphic and development context each community is planning for. This slide here illustrates some different considerations related to bay, bluff, and dune environments. The sample policies can serve as a launching pad to initiate development of individual, customized local government adaptation policies. And another reason customizing language is necessary is related to what I mentioned before. Some of the model policies in the guidance reflect a more general policy, the kind you would see in a land use plan, and some have more relevance to implementation or zoning policy, the kind you would see in an implementation plan. So local governments should really customize the model policies to align with their community's approach. And again, not all approaches listed here will be appropriate for every jurisdiction, and this is not an exhaustive list of options. So if you find something that's missing or that you wish was included after you review our draft document, we really would welcome that feedback. So in summary, I want to repeat a few key messages. First, updating LCPs to address sea level rise is an important Coastal Commission priority, and this policy guidance is intended to assist local governments in doing so. Some additional take-home points are noted here on this slide as well. As sea level rises, proactive adaptation will be necessary to preserve coastal resources on a migrating shoreline. The strongest approach for minimizing hazards is to avoid siting new development within areas vulnerable to flooding, inundation, and erosion, and thus ensure stable site conditions without the need for long-term financial and resource commitments for protective devices. Next, related to internalizing risk, educating shoreline property owners about sea level rise impacts will be vital to adaptation strategies that can be proactive and minimize takings risks. When property owners understand and assume the risks and mitigate the coastal resource impacts of new development in hazardous areas, which we refer to as internalizing risk, the public no longer bears that burden. A community visioning process and adaptation plan are vital to scoping the appropriate strategies a community will phase over time to address hazards as they become manifest. Protecting public trust lands and resources, including as sea level rises, is important. New shoreline protective devices should not result in the loss of public trust lands. Where allowed under the Coastal Act or the relevant LPP, shoreline protective devices should be sited, designed, and conditioned to ensure that they do not result in a loss of public trust lands or encroach onto public trust lands without the permission of the appropriate trustee agency. The Coastal Commission will continue to provide avenues for and encourage maximum public participation in planning and regulatory processes, and will continue to establish and/or expand non-traditional alliances, such as between and among public and private resource managers, tribal groups, scientists, and other decision makers. Share knowledge openly and actively, and regularly and clearly communicate to the public on the science, as well as on a range of solutions to prepare for sea level rise. While sea level rise vulnerability assessments and integration to LCP planning will look different across jurisdictions due to the diversity of shoreline development contexts, all communities would benefit from starting now on an adaptation planning process to prepare for the long-term resilience of their built and natural resources. So the comment period is now open, and we anticipate it closing on September 29th. we want to give time for response to comments and revisions, and comments can be submitted by email to residentialadaptation@coastal.ca.gov. Please check our website for additional webinars and updates. Our final draft is anticipated in the fall of this year, taking that to the hearing for adoption. So thanks to everyone who called in today to learn more about our draft policy guidance. We look forward to receiving your comments and updating the draft. And I think we're now going to be available for any questions that those of you on the line might have. And again, you can type those questions into the question box on the GoToWebinar. And I'll turn this over to other folks to help me answer some of the question box submissions. And I just also want to let you guys know that this webinar will be posted on our website. A couple of other webinars are already posted, the videos and the slides from this presentation today. And again, we welcome direct questions at our email address that's listed on this slide here too. So guys, do we have any questions typed in?
We're slowly getting a couple of questions. So yeah, feel free to type those questions into the chat box or the question box, whatever you think is best, or whatever you have. One of the first questions we have.
Yeah, hi, this is Madeline with the Sea Level Rise team, Madeline Cavalieri. I see there's a question here about the potential for state-funded buyouts for property in hazardous areas. Part of the question also was about whether this guidance could mandate state purchase of those properties. Unfortunately, through this document, we don't have funding resources available to be able to require that kind of thing. This is a policy guidance document. We certainly agree that funding is necessary for implementation of adaptation strategies, including buyouts and other retreat strategies. We've been fortunate to have some funding available for planning for sea level rise, but there has not yet been much available for implementation of strategies. We have been working with FEMA to try and understand how local governments can best utilize disaster and pre-disaster funds that might be available. And we are certainly communicating where we can what the the huge need that we see out there for funding for sea level rise adaptation. Certainly seems possible that in the future there could be some kind of bond funding that might be available. So certainly appreciate that comment, and I would encourage folks to continue to communicate those needs to us and also through other avenues.
Our next question is about how this residential adaptation guidance is going to incorporate or relate to sort of the revisions from the OPC state sea level rise guidance that's going to be adopted or released later this fall and then adopted hopefully in January of 2018.
So this is Carrie with the Sea Level Rise team here at the Coastal Commission. So because this is a pending document, the actual model policies that are provided in this guidance document don't directly reference the specific information provided by the OPC report. What does relate to the OPC report is the example policies about the selection of best available science. So because the guidance document provides a model policy that references incorporating the most up-to-date and current best available science into the planning process or to inform site-specific hazard studies for coastal development permits, in that sense, once the state guidance document is adopted, perhaps with updated sea level rise projections, those projections could be incorporated.
One question just about where the draft is located. So there was a link to the draft early on in the presentation, but also if you go to the Commission's Sea Level Rise webpage, you'll be able to find a link from there. Should be pretty easy. It's under the Sea Level Rise page and then under the adaptation.
If you go to the very home page of our Coastal Commission website, there's a link in the highlights box. You just click on it and it'll take you to the draft document page.
Couple questions here about maintaining existing shoreline protection. First of all, existing legally permitted shoreline protection can be repaired. Oftentimes a permit is required for that repair, but it wouldn't necessitate a review of the entire structure as a new structure in some cases. What I would point you to, though, is our definition or the guidance related to how to define redevelopment. At some point, repair and maintenance may become the redevelopment or new development of a structure, at which point the guidance would direct local governments to review anew whether the structure is permittable and evaluate the structure that it's protecting and go through the full analysis.
All the questions we have for now, but please continue to type those in if you have any. We'll hang out for a little while longer if you guys have more questions. Not seeing any additional questions. I don't know if you have any final thoughts, just reminders about getting in any public comments you have.
Please do send any written comments to us at residentialadaptation@coastal.ca.gov. And again, check our website as well. Here we'll be listing if we have additional events for you to sign up for or to access the materials for.
All right, getting a couple more questions now.
There's one question about the comment deadline.
So the comment deadline is,
it's been recently extended to September 29, so we should have most of that updated on our website. It might still show the old deadline in our past staff report document, but
right. We'll be sending out an email soon to a lot of folks. Anybody also on our mailing list here that we are extending the public comment deadline until the end of September.
Right, so the new date is September 29th.
And there was a question about where the language is regarding redevelopment and meeting that threshold of exceeding something that would be considered repair and maintenance. So I'd point you to policy B7 on page 46.
I think that's it. Feel free to ask any more questions if you have them. We'll keep waiting on the line.
I just note also that if questions come up after this, you can feel free to send those questions to the residential adaptation email address, and that's also available for submitting your public comment, but we're happy to respond to questions that way as well. So we have a question about additional work coming up. Is the commission going to have more staff and budget to address this kind of work? And on the whole, I would say we don't have any large expansions of our budget or staffing planned. However, we are anticipating some additional federal funds that will help support additional guidance work. We're looking at hopefully developing additional policy guidance related to critical infrastructure development and working with other state and local agencies, regional entities on pursuing that policy guidance development.
There's a question about expectations regarding how detailed hazard exposure mapping should be with sea level rise as part of an LCP update. I think that's probably best addressed in our sea level rise policy guidance from 2015. In general, I think our overall approach is that we're hope and are supporting local governments in doing vulnerability assessments, and we recognize that there's a range of ways that that might come in. You know, I think the important point we make, though, is that even if you have sort of limited staff or budget or technical resources, you know, any amount of vulnerability assessment is good. It can set the stage for careful planning. There are a lot of existing tools out there that are pretty sophisticated, and more coming all the time. And I think the sea level rise policy guidance, like I mentioned, is a good place for more information on that topic, as well as a lot of the work that's been completed through the LCP grant program, all of which can be found on our Coastal Commission website. You can see a lot of the work that other LCP grantees have completed, including drafts of their vulnerability assessments and that sort of thing.
There's an additional follow-up question about definition of redevelopment. I'm a little unclear on the question. I think that it might be good for the commenter to reach out to us, and maybe we could have a phone conversation to talk about it a little bit further. So please feel free to send a note to our email address, and we can try and set something up.
Questions seem to be slowing down again, but again, we'll keep staying on the line. Give it a little while longer. Otherwise, like we've all been saying, feel free to address any questions you have to the residential adaptation email or public comments as well through that same email, and we'll certainly try and follow up as we can. Not really seeing any more questions, so I think we might cut it off here.
Thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to your comments as well.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.